We've been talking about obviously the Ten Commandments and particularly about the Sabbath. And we looked the last time we were here looking at the Sabbath stuff. We looked at this passage in Leviticus that talks about not just a Sabbath day once a week, but actually a Sabbath year every seventh year. And so as we went through this, we're not going to rehash this too much, but as we went through this, one of the biggest points that comes away from this is that there is a significant amount of trust and faith that God is requiring with this command. One out of 7 days, don't do any work, is manageable. I mean, you can plan, you can gather extra, you can lay aside, do what you need to do for 1 day. Or worst case scenario, if you didn't make any plans, you didn't lay anything aside, for 1 day you don't eat. For most of us, for me, that would be a positive thing probably if I just didn't eat 1 day a week. But for most of us, we could go a day without eating, and it wouldn't be fun necessarily, but we could do it. But a year is not the sort of thing where you can just go, yeah, I'll just take a year off. If I don't have any food, that'll be fine. And so there's a significant element of trusting that, number one, you're going to be blessed enough in those first 6 years to be able to save for that seventh year. And number two, that you're going to be able to, to access what you need beyond that from the land itself, when everybody is just kind of eating what's available. And that's the other aspect of this, is that he says in here, if you look in starting in verse 5, he says you're not supposed to, you're not even supposed to reap the aftergrowth, the part that grows up, that naturally grows even though you didn't seed it or plant it or anything like that. You're not supposed to reap that. You're not supposed to gather. You're supposed to leave it alone. But in verse 6 he says, all of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food. In other words, anybody can go in and take, some food that they can find in the land. And it doesn't appear that there's any real sense of only on your own property. It's kind of just wherever you do it, because it talks about male and female slaves, hired man's, foreign resident, people who live as alien. All of those people are going to access the land as a whole to eat from as the land provides. So there's an element of faith, but there's also an element of charity that's built into this as well. Now, why would he want to link those two things? Why would God choose to link those two ideas? Okay.
It takes faith to give away what you have. And Paul even tells, I think it's the Ephesians, that go get a job so that you have something you can share.
Yeah.
And that's part of why God has put us here. That's part of the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And I don't know if you made this point when you first did this till we weren't here, but this was especially impactful to them because they didn't have Sam's, Costco, and Walmart.
Right.
This was an agrarian society. Their whole sustenance and economy were based on these crops.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that is actually a good point that we didn't talk about last time, which is you can't just go to the store and get some food if you don't have any. You might, in fact, probably could borrow from your neighbor in a pinch, but if you need a whole year's worth of food, your neighbor's probably not going to be in a position to supply you with that either. And it's important to note that this is not the first time that God has made provision for a long-term need by creating an opportunity of plenty beforehand. If you think about the situation in Egypt that Joseph oversaw, 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. God made provision, and through his people and through the people he chose, made sure that the process was set up to take care of people during the bad times by doing things during the good times. So God has a sense of the needs of people. It's not that he's unaware. Jesus says quite the opposite, in fact. But at the same time, God also asks us to be faithful and to be charitable even in times of leanness.
That's what I was going to ask you, is that like later on, especially in centuries, where it kind of was I wonder if it was a built-in system where the poor were kind of, the gleaning thing with Ruth, and that, that it was kind of a built-in system through faith by God and through his commandment that the poor would be taken care of, I wonder.
That's certainly, there's elements of that built in to the system. For example, what you just quoted, that's not just something that sprang up, that's in the law. It talks about when you go and you harvest, for example, you kind of harvest around a corner, you don't go back and then get everything in that corner. as you go along, if some stuff gets left behind, you don't go back and pick it up, or you don't go back and take it. You leave it so that it leaves it for the poor and widows and things like that, who can go out then and gather something that they need. And there are other provisions and other things where God talks about being kind to the widows and the aliens and orphans and things like that, that suggests that during the time of when things were good, before they were taken into captivity, that the theory at least was that people would be doing that, and out of the abundance of what they were blessed with, they would be able to help one another and those people in need. Now, after the captivity and they come back, things are typically leaner, and the result is that there is more of a need for charity and less to go around. And so in a way, you have more of a need for faith than even before you did. And so that becomes complicated. Barbara?
You look at during that pandemic, when people were just hoarding stuff and going to the stores and just buying everything they could off the shelves.
Right.
And not, I mean, where was their faith in God, that God was going to take care of them?
Right.
They were creating the problem by going and not shopping the way they normally did.
Right.
By just grabbing everything and not leaving it for other people and stuff, and just hoarding stuff.
Yeah.
And so they were creating the problem by being selfish and not sharing and trusting God to take care of it.
And that's you can differentiate that from, for example, not to use them as a singularly positive example, but in this context, one of the things that Latter-day Saints have as part of their mission and expectation is that they will store a certain amount of food and dry goods and stuff like that for a crisis. But they do it over time. They don't all run to the store like, once every, 6 months when they're going to get checked on or something like that and buy it all right then. They do it over time as part of their regular process. And there's a big difference between that kind of let's be prepared and also have faith, and let's do a run and get everything we need right now because we don't have any faith, and we're determined we're going to just get whatever we can. And so there is that lack of faith that we see a lot of times coming out, and it's natural. When you look at animals do not naturally share their food. They don't, now with their young and their families they do, but if you have, for example, scavengers around a corpse, they're all trying to get whatever they can. And not, squirrels hide nuts for themselves, not for the whole community. It's not, and so by and large, our human nature, our earthly nature tells us, keep it all for you, put it all away, don't trust that you're going to get what you need from some other source, make it all about you. But what we are called to do by the divine nature is very different, and a very different mindset. And we see that reflected in the Sabbath command, and then we also see that reflected conversely, as we're going to look at in just a second here, in how Jesus addresses the Sabbath when it comes to particular needs, and the recognition that faith and priorities sometimes dictate ignoring some of the details of the Sabbath to do what's more necessary. So, Jerry.
How long do you suspect they followed this? I mean, you don't have any real record of them doing it.
So here's what I would say. What we find that is disturbing is that when you go and look at the archaeology, you go and look at what limited records we do have, there's very little evidence to suggest that the temple worship thing at all was honored by most of Israel, or that the provision for the Levites and the priests was honored very consistently at all throughout most of Israel's history. Throughout the time of the judges, throughout most of the kings, with a few exceptions. David, Saul probably actually, Saul, David, Solomon, and a couple of other times there are kings where both the biblical stories themselves, but also the historical record suggest that there was at least some effort to follow that system. Now that's not the same system as the Sabbath system, but my guess is that the two things kind of go hand in hand as a practical matter. And that would suggest that probably considerably less, or no more than 10% of the total time that Israel was an independent nation, did they actually consistently follow the Sabbath across the board. Now I'm sure, as we find today, that there were some Israelites who did, and that there were many others who didn't, and in the absence of some kind of a governmental oversight leadership function mandate that the majority didn't, because they didn't have to, because they didn't want to.
That's why there were 70 years in Babylon, so 70 times they did not do it. And if you like 70 times, 490, then 490 years, 70 times they did not do this, that the land was spared.
Wasn't, yeah, so it was, so they, so, you know, so there's the, that's, it's not mythology, there's the numerology approach to looking at it, and like I said, there's just not a lot of evidence that any of those systems that were set up to be nationwide were really regularly followed during most of Israel's existence. Now, after they returned from captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah went through great pains to reestablish and to really shore up the Levitical system and the priestly system, and that from that point on, there was significant effort given to those things, and again, I'm quite confident that also to the Sabbath and to following the Sabbath. And so, you know, that's done in, what would that be, 300, the early 300s, and it continues through into the time of Christ, where we see a very, very rigid system about, and the development during that period of time of much of the modern day rules relating to things like the Passover and the Sabbath and different things like that that are practiced by modern day Orthodox Jews. We see that being developed in a much more, there's a lot more consistency, and there's the additional rules, and say what you want to about the Pharisees and making up new rules, at least what they did do is make sure everybody was definitely doing the Sabbath and definitely following the temple worship and those kinds of things. So during the time before Israel goes into captivity, there's every reason to believe that there was very little consistent following of this, just as there is very little consistent following of the idolatry commands. You know, when you look at the time of the judges, it kind of looks like all 10 of the commandments were pretty much ignored. So different times of Israel's history, they did a little better, a little worse, but probably not too great. So let me move on into the time that I was mentioning there, which is where you do now have very rigid rules that have been defined both in terms of going back to the Old Testament or to the Torah and those things and pulling out the actual rules, and then the addition of a number of different customs and regulations that the Pharisees in particular created as a hedge around the law itself to make sure that people didn't get too close to trespassing on the law, and that's the time of Christ. And we see a number of different occasions where Jesus runs up against the legalism of the Pharisees when it comes to the Sabbath. One of the early ones is over in Mark chapter 2, says that it happened that Jesus was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now this one's kind of an interesting one, because if you look at the law, it simply says don't work on the Sabbath. But what was one of the earliest things that God had told the Israelites not to do when it came to the Sabbath, even before he'd given them the specific command about the Sabbath?
Don't gather the manna.
Yeah, don't gather the manna. So this, in terms of, you know, if the lawyer in me says, if we're looking for parallels, this is like this, that sure does look a lot like gathering the manna on the Sabbath. And yet, that's what Jesus and his disciples are doing. And Jesus says back to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and he also gave it to those who were with it. Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. All right, so let's kind of unpack this. Anybody know the story that Jesus is referencing about David and the unleavened bread? How many of you are familiar with that story? Okay, some of you are. Let me go through this real quickly then. So David has been in the service of Saul. He's killed Goliath. He's become basically a general in Saul's army. And Saul, who's descending into basically demonically induced madness, decides that David is the enemy. And so he begins to hunt for David, trying to kill him. David has to go on the run on several different occasions. He has a small group of companions that comes with him where he's going. And at one point, in the urgency of his flight, he basically has to take off without weapons and without food. And he comes to the priests who at the time were in a different location than where the king was, because the temple hadn't been built yet. The tabernacle was set up in a place I believe called Nob. And David goes there with his men, and basically puts himself on the mercy of the priest and says, we need food, and I need a weapon if I can get a weapon. And the priest says, the high priest says to it, we don't have any food except the showbread, which is set out before the altar every day, and then we're supposed to eat it. And so the only bread I have to give you is consecrated bread, and you're not supposed to eat that. And David's response to that, or he either, I can't remember if he responds or he implies that he is on a mission for God, and therefore it's legitimate for him, the priest, to give him the bread for him to take with him and for his men to eat. And it turns out the other weapon that's available is one that rightfully belongs to David anyway, because it's whose sword? Goliath's. Now, think about it. I've always thought about that, man. David must have grown up into a pretty strong dude, because Goliath's sword was massive. That's a different story, though. So here's what's interesting out of that story, or here's what I want you guys to think with me about out of that story. David makes an interesting claim to the priest in terms of what he's doing. That he is on a mission from God, essentially, and that's why it's legitimate for the priest to give him the food. Now, that would seem to have two weaknesses to it. Number one, he hasn't been given a mission, he's running from the king, and number two, even so, it's still in the law says it's for the priests only. There's nothing in it that says the priest, and also if somebody's on a mission from God, then then it's okay. So why does that reasoning hold up so that Jesus later on says, he doesn't commend him, but he uses that as an example to excuse or to explain what he's doing. How does that hold up? Jerry?
I think it's parallel in at least a limited sense with Christ's comment about if the donkey that falls in the hole on the Sabbath, you're going to pull it out.
Okay.
And I think there was a need that Saul had with his men that I guess superseded the requirement of the showbread for the priest. It just seems like that's kind of parallel, that here we had a true need, the donkey's in the hole, and a true need that these men need sustenance. So
I agree with you, but here's what I want us to try to differentiate. If I didn't gather any manna or enough manna for 2 days before the Sabbath day, on the Sabbath day I have a need. I'm very hungry at that point because I didn't gather any extra food.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? And there is a difference. I'm not trying to say there isn't. But what is the difference between the situation with the person who didn't prepare and the situation that David is facing? So I have a hand up. I don't know if it's to answer my question or not.
David said, because he does it for God, it's with God. If you go back, when Moses got the Israelites out of Egypt, he did it for God too. Every time when he put the staff out, what God told him to do, that it went. If not, then the enemy took over. So he did what God said. If you are with God, then when you do what God tells you, that overrides everything.
Okay, so this is a really interesting thing, and I think Sylvia is exactly right. Was David in the service of God? Was he on a mission from God when he was fleeing from Saul?
Yes.
What was his mission at that point?
He had already been anointed king.
Okay, so he actually has a job, and if he's dead, he can't do that job. And so in one sense, and actually in a larger sense in general, David is on a mission from God, which is to avoid being killed by this lunatic so that he can take the throne, which is what God has commissioned him to do. But he also understands that his mission is not to overthrow that king, not to incite a rebellion against him, not to kill him himself. That's God's job. So David recognizes that his only option is to flee, and therefore he is actually on a mission from God. But Sylvia makes a point that expands this even more, and I think it's important. David is in God's service in a broader sense. David spent most of his life, with a couple of glaring exceptions, doing what God wanted, chasing after God's heart, the scriptures say. And so David's life is devoted to service to God. He is, in his case, he has literally been consecrated to God by the anointing that took place for him. So David is operating under a slightly different set of rules than the average Israelite does, at least because of the choices they make. Ken?
I think also there's a dimension and the reason Christ uses this is that Zechariah prophesies that when the Messiah comes, he will come as prophet, priest, and king. And in the case of David and Abiathar, David is showing the priestliness and the kingliness of the future Messiah coming together.
So there's an archetypical aspect
Right.
to this. Yeah, I agree. And so David is in a position that is unusual,
Right.
both because of the choices that he's made in the past and the fact that he has been chosen and anointed as the king.
This parallels for me a problem that I've had a lot with God talking not that we shouldn't be lying, and how many times God's purpose is expanded because somebody lies. You know, that it seems like that maybe there's a time when things may not be exactly required. I mean, you look at Naaman. You know, he takes a wheelbarrow full of dirt back and prays and asks Samuel to give him, you know, to let him worship their God, and knowing that he's violating the real God. I mean, it just seems like maybe that God looks at motive sometime, maybe at least seems to look at motive in some of those occasions.
Yeah. Well, so we can think of, one of the things that I think is interesting is if you look in the Old Testament, you really don't have a commandment not to lie, strictly speaking. You have things like don't give false witness. That's a different situation. False witnesses don't lie under oath, basically, or in an official proceeding would kind of be maybe a better way to say it. And there, you're always going to find truth is better than lying in the big picture. But there are multiple examples, as you said with lying, where people in the Bible lie to advance God's purpose, either people who were God's people or people who were not God's people. To me, the most notable of all those is Rahab, who hides the spies and then lies to the people who are coming looking for them. And she's commended later for doing those things, but literally commended for doing that exact thing. So,
Well, God told Samuel, say you're coming to make a sacrifice.
that's right. He actually, and in that case, technically he was, but
Yeah.
you know, but it was,
God's the original
so
marketing
exactly. So God, what did you say?
He's the original marketing guy.
That's right. Well, it's not just the marketing, but he's as good at splitting hairs as anybody else is, you know, and so that was. The key to this is to recognize that, I think when it comes to some of this stuff, is to recognize that there is a difference between when God says, this is what you need to do to make this work, and when God is speaking just generally about how we're supposed to deal with each other in the abstract. So in the New Testament, we have commands like speak the truth to one another in love. We don't anywhere in the New Testament have the command, you can lie to somebody else and it'll make them feel better. There's speak to the truth in love. Now, that can also sometimes mean keep your mouth shut when it's not loving and it doesn't need to be said. But other times, if it does need to be said, you sometimes have to say things that people don't want to hear. So there's shading to this, but take it a step further and consider that deliberate killing in the old law is murder. Except when you've been told to go lay waste to an entire population of Canaanites, in which case it is simply a divine job from God.
Or
No
the king tells you to kill this guy.
Well, I mean, that's I'm talking about my favorite minor character in the entire Bible, the guy who falls upon people and they're dead afterwards. So, but yeah, I mean, when you are doing God's will, there are exceptions to the standard ways that we do things. Now, this is dangerous though, because when we start thinking in these terms, this is what people use to justify all kinds of really, really bad stuff. And so I don't want to take us too far down this road. For the moment, I want to take us back to what we're actually talking about here, because this is another discussion that's too big for us to try to get through in this class, and I'm not prepared to do it, and I don't want us to get halfway through it and leave it somewhere, and then people go out and, you know, rob a bank and say, this preacher told me to do it because God wanted me to. So I'm just not going to do that. So we're going to step back for a second here and take it to the Sabbath aspect of it, where hopefully nobody's going to get hurt if you apply this too literally. So So the point that we're getting at here, though, is that David, number one, in a broad sense in his life, is on a mission from God because he's chosen to embrace God's will as fully as possible. He's on a specific mission from God because he's been consecrated and anointed as king, so he already has in him the seeds of the authority of the king, and he definitely has the need to carry out God's will to become king. And so for these reasons, when he goes to Abiathar and says, I need food, and the only option is consecrated bread, well, he has been consecrated. He is on a mission, and the men that are with him, by choosing to follow him, have basically joined in that consecration. Now, this is not as, even if he'd explained all this to Abiathar in those terms, even if he'd understood it in those terms, this would not necessarily have been a deal breaker for Abiathar. Because Abiathar has served during the same time as another guy named Samuel. And what did Samuel do that he shouldn't have ever done? Anybody know? According to the law, what did Samuel do that he should never have done? The same thing he actually condemned Saul for doing.
Oh, he offered sacrifice. He was a
Yeah,
Levite.
he offered sacrifices. He was a Levite, probably. It might not have been, but he wasn't a priest. And yet he was offering sacrifices. And I've talked about this before in a sermon that I did, but I believe that the reason why he was able to do that is because at the very beginning of his life, his mother made a promise to God and said, if you give me a son, I'm going to hand him over to you and he's going to be yours forever. And she did it, and she handed him over to Eli the priest. And I think in doing that, she consecrated Samuel into God's service in a way that superseded the law about Levites and priests and who offer sacrifices. And so I think that in David's case, it's a very similar circumstance to that, where he has been consecrated into God's service, he's doing what God wants, and under those circumstances, he has the authority to ask for something that would ordinarily only be available to the priests. And so that's what he does. And so he's given that. He's also given, and I think it's interesting that it's Goliath's sword. It's not just some sword that's there. But I think that the writer made a deliberate parallel to say what I said at the beginning, which is it's David's sword by right, because what?
He killed it.
He killed it. It's his by right. It was his, he could have taken that sword, but probably couldn't at the time because it would have been too heavy for him when he was still a boy. But it's his right to have that sword. And notice who's got the sword.
He could pick it up because he used it.
That's true. They probably wouldn't want to lug it around with them day by day, but that's a good point. So here's the other aspect of this, though. Why is the sword of Goliath in the hands of the priests in the first place? You ever thought about that? Did the priests need a sword, and do they really need the biggest sword that's been made?
For safekeeping.
It's for safekeeping. It's because it's a relic, basically. And I use relic not in the sense of something that's really old, but in the sense of something that has religious significance. So it is logical that they would have it, the same way that museums or things like that sometimes have important documents. And it is also logical that David would be the one to take it up, because it is the symbol of a victory that was caused by God through him, and he has the right to carry that sword in a way that nobody else really does. So all of this situation that we look at in the past here informs what we're looking at here, because just like you talk about the archetype, Jesus is referencing, exactly, Jesus is referencing the archetype, and the archetype is pointing towards this situation where Jesus says, hey, you know what? David was on a mission from God because of who he was. And guess what I'm here for? I'm on a mission from God. I'm the king, I'm the high priest. You don't all understand that yet. Some of you will never figure it out. But I have the right to this because of who I am and what I'm doing. And when we talk about the Sabbath in particular, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath because of those things, and I have the right to step outside of that in times of need. Jerry?
I'll just throw this out there because I'm not sure, I never have fully understood what Solomon means when in Ecclesiastes where he says, don't be too religious. I'm wondering if there is any overlap in what we're talking about with that.
I think that in a broad sense, what Solomon is saying is don't let your religion get in the way of your faith, kind of, don't let the practice become the faith.
That might be one way
but,
to look
but I don't know,
yeah.
But you're right. I mean, there's an element of what Jesus is saying here is that the whole point of the law and the Sabbath in particular is to it's partly it's a definition of God's character, but God's character begins with love and mercy. And so if God's character is shown through the law, then to some extent at least, how we practice the law needs to be a reflection of that. But specifically with regard to the Sabbath was meant to be a day of rest, not a day where man is desperately hungry. Just as the laws about the priest and the showbread were meant to honor God and to show God's provision, not to ruin or risk the possibility that this guy who's on a mission from God won't have a chance to eat and may die. So I got a bunch of hands down. Let me start with Steve because he was first.
Well, sometimes you get into scriptures that are kind of hard. You're like, well, why make exceptions to rules and stuff? So I think when Jesus sums it up at the very end is the real key, and that is the Sabbath was made for man and not the other way around. Okay, so the Sabbath wasn't created and then God created man in order to obey the Sabbath, meaning that the Sabbath is much more important than mankind. So I think the idea here is that mankind is more important. So technically speaking, we can try and work it out in our thoughts, but technically speaking, David shouldn't have eaten the consecrated bread. That was for another purpose. And the disciples shouldn't have been picking grain and eating it. So the Pharisees point that out and say, hey, you know, technically, you're breaking it here. And Jesus is basically saying, well, look, if there's a sign in front of a lake that says no swimming and someone is drowning, then you have to say, well, technically, I can't go in there and save that person. But what's more important, the obedience to the technicality or the saving of a life?
Yeah. And we're going to get even more into that in the next story we look at, but not yet because I've got other hands.
So that's exactly what I was going to point out that I saw for the first time, is that Jesus is kind of bringing the heart to the law, where he's saying, because I can't remember in all my studies of the Old Testament, this is something new. The Sabbath was made for man.
Yeah.
And not the man for the Sabbath. So that's what I was seeing, and you nailed it there with that. That is the key, isn't it? And a new revelation, so to speak, through Christ Jesus to the Jews at that point, because all those centuries of the law, do this, don't do that. And Jesus goes to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
So is that the first time that you know of?
That's been said particularly?
Yes.
Specifically, yes. Jesus is the first one to specifically say that. You don't see that
That's amazing.
statement in the Old Testament. But what you do see, Jesus has asked the question at one point, what's the most important commandment? And what does he say?
Love the Lord thy God.
And the second is,
Love
love your neighbor as yourself. So he doesn't go to the Sabbath, he doesn't go to murder, he doesn't go to idolatry even, which is definitely a big one. He says the two most important commands are love the Lord and love your neighbor. And so even though the Sabbath is never called out and said it's for man and any of this other stuff, built into the law, and the lawyer who asked him the question goes, yeah, that's the right answer, you know. And I suspect that of the many times of the Sabbath that the Pharisees asked questions of Jesus, this is one of the times that they most agreed with his answer, even if they didn't like the fact that he answered correctly. Because they all knew that was the law, that the most important command was loving God and the second most was loving each other. And in knowing that, then some of this stuff becomes a lot more intuitive if you apply it that way. But a lot of Jesus's point with the Pharisees over and over again is you don't apply it that way. You apply it like it's a set of rules, and you don't love God because you're not really interested in whether you love him or not. You're just interested in following the rules. I mean, you definitely don't love man in the way that you're following the rules. So, Ken, I think you had your hand up as
I
well.
defer to my classmates. They both said what I was going to say.
All right. So let's expand that thought in just a couple minutes we have here, but since we're kind of covering the same ground, hopefully we can actually get through this, because then we see this passage in Mark chapter 3, so just a chapter later. It says, he entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. They were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Now, in different passages about similar situations, the Pharisees actually bring the person there and put him in front of Jesus to see what Jesus will do. So he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And he said to them, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? And they kept silent. Now this is interesting, because he doesn't just say, is it lawful to do good? He says, is it lawful to do bad, to do harm to people on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to kill on the Sabbath? And they don't want to say anything to him. Why don't they want to say anything to him? What answer are they afraid of giving here?
There's no right answer to them.
Okay.
For them.
So for them, there really isn't. Now, what's interesting though is they don't say no. Because they know that there's parts of the law about, saving your son from a well. That's actually in the law, that, you can do that. So they know that at least sometimes it's okay to do good. But like a good lawyer, they don't want to answer because it depends, and that's not an answer that makes anybody happy. So they don't want to answer it. So he looks around them with anger. I think this is really interesting. One of the few times we actually see Jesus angry. Now, they're lucky, I guess, that they're not selling things in the temple because he'd be whipping them right now, but he's just angry at them, and he's grieved at their hardness of heart because he knows that they know the answer, I think. He knows that they know the answer. And the answer is that it's okay to heal somebody, to do something that's good like that. So he says to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. Now, why do the Pharisees have that reaction to it? I mean, it's not the first time he's criticized them about the way they view the Sabbath. It's not the first time he's criticized them in general. Why do they have such a strong reaction?
It questions their authority.
Okay, how so?
Well, because when Jesus answers, they're used to having this, attention and everything else for being the experts in it, and it becomes his authority versus their authority.
Mm-hmm.
And that angers them.
Okay, so part of it is that he is questioning their authority. You notice in this case he doesn't even make the argument that he did previously about the Sabbath and this. He just does it. Now there's several other times when he does situations like this, and at least one of them he also references the commands about the Sabbath that relate to pulling an ox or a donkey out of the ditch. So he has made that reference at some point, and he may have even done it here, and Mark is just doing kind of a shorthand version. We don't know, but it's absolutely true that he's questioning their authority, he's challenging their authority. Sylvia?
The one thing is the Pharisees, they wanted to have everyone under their thumb and do their regulation, had nothing to do with God because God not even did tell them to do so. And then it's like today, there are some churches that like they have rules like the Pharisees did.
Keep everybody under their thumb. Yep.
Yeah, to be able to do what they want and let the people obey them instead of God.
Yes. Sarah, do you have your hand up? Or
Yeah, is this the first time that he's done a miracle like this in front of the Pharisees?
It's the first time that he's done a miracle. Well, it depends. What do you mean by like this?
Well, I guess on the Sabbath in front of the Pharisees.
Okay. Yes. So this is the key. This is the thing, and this is where you took Sarah. What Sarah said, you put it with what you said. This isn't just some guy who says, "I disagree with you. Here's what I think." This is some guy who says, "Okay, you know what? I'm going to do what you say I'm not supposed to do, and I'm going to do something that I could only do if God is empowering me." So think about this. What Jesus did isn't simply to say, "I know better than you." What he's saying is, "I know better than you, and God says I'm right," and he proves it. And he does the same thing with the man who can't walk when he's lowered down in front of him. He says, "Your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees and the people that are there are like, "He can't do that," in their mind. And Jesus knows what they're saying or what they're thinking, and he says, "Okay, which is harder, to forgive somebody's sins or to heal them?" And of course, strictly speaking, it's harder to forgive their sins, although it's harder to check if that's what you said.
Which is harder to say.
Yeah, but what he means by that is the actual forgiveness of it. Of course, it's actually technically easier to say that because nobody can check for sure. But his point is, of the two things, forgiving sins is the harder one. But then he says, so that you know that I have the authority to do that, get up and walk. And when he gets up and walks, there's no question, God's not going to let a guy who just blasphemed make somebody get up and walk. Just as if the rules about the Sabbath that the Pharisees think are true are what God really wants, he's not going to be able to do the healing on the Sabbath either. Now I've got 4 more hands, so let's start with Sarah because hers was first, and then we'll work our way around and wrap this up.
So I don't think he's challenging. He's been challenging the Pharisees. He's usurping them now.
Yeah,
Right.
that's exactly right. It's no
Right.
longer simply, here's what I think, now it's definitive, here's the right answer.
Correct.
And there's no way you can argue with this, and that's a real problem for them. And that's why they have to kill it. You can't just keep arguing with this guy, because now, this is, my brother says, in a conversation where you're both debating biblical issues, at whatever point somebody says, "God told me so," it's the end of the conversation. Not because they're necessarily right, but because there's nothing else to be said after that. And that's kind of what's happening here, is it's like, God is on my side, so we're done. And they know they're not going to be able to win this argument, so there's only really one fallback position, and that is we got to get rid of the guy. Okay, so I had hands back there, I think Linda and also, or no, not Linda, okay, yes.
Yes, back in verse 5, when put forth the question to them publicly. And when he had looked around about on them with anger, Jesus, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he exactly put them down, usurped their authority because he is the Lord, and he did it publicly. And that
Yeah.
was when they wanted to
Kill him.
right, get together.
Right, they start
decide-
conspiring.
to
And
discuss
this, by the way, is the point at which they start to form alliance with a group of people that they have nothing in common with, the Herodians. So, Jerry, did you have your hand up?
I was just thinking, just put it in simple words, Christ just flat embarrassed them.
Yes, that's
I mean,
true.
and now they're holding a grudge because they're embarrassed.
Well, there's no way they can overcome
There's
that.
no way they
Yeah.
can, and the people that were listening, I mean, there had to be other people there. They knew the answer as well.
Right,
And
there's,
so they were publicly embarrassed, and so they're angry.
Yeah.
I mean, we see that today, if you embarrass somebody, their first response is anger.
yeah. Kim, did you have your hand up?
I did, but it was the hardest of hard thing.
Okay.
They get harder and harder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that, going on as conspiring with the Herodians is the next example of that, because they had nothing in common with them. In every way, they disliked them and disagreed with them, and yet, where do they go? They go, because the Herodians have power in the temple, and they have power from the Romans, and so they got to ally themselves with the other power groups. So, last one is Steve.
Okay, real quick, so, the Pharisees set themselves up to be embarrassed. They set
that's right.
themselves up on the proverbial throne of judgment over God's word, period, and Jesus came along and said, excuse me, you're in my chair. And they don't like that. Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true. And to the extent that, at least, if this is like the other examples, that they were the one that brought the guy there, not only did they set themselves up with the judge, but they set up the whole case to actually think that they were going to win, and it turns out that it all falls apart on them. So this is as bad a situation as you can have. You think about when you think everything's going to go your way and you get a reversal, that's like the worst time. It's bad enough when you lose, but when you thought for sure you were going to win, that's when it really stings. So, okay, we got to stop because we're over. Thank you guys for your comments and your ideas.